The Vanished Village, Part 2. The village of Ravenswood lay silent, as it always had. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer writhed, and the unnatural glow of the lampposts had faded to nothing. Yet, deep in the heart of the forgotten town, something had changed. A week had passed since Thomas Aldridge vanished. Far from Ravenswood, a lone traveler named Claire Mason read an article online about his disappearance. She hadn't known Thomas personally, but recognized the name. They had crossed paths years ago in a hiking group, and she remembered his love for seeking out remote places. His sudden vanishing piqued her curiosity, but what truly drew her in was the description of Ravenswood, a village that didn't exist on any map. Claire was no stranger to uncovering mysteries. As a freelance journalist, she specialized in chasing legends and uncovering forgotten histories. The story of a man disappearing in an unmarked village whispered of something beyond ordinary tragedy. Against her better judgment, she decided to follow his trail. Armed with a notebook, a camera, and an old map of the area where Thomas's last signal was traced, Claire set out. She drove for hours, passing fields and forests that grew denser with every mile. The road was rough, barely more than a dirt track, and her GPS had long since lost its signal. Still, she pressed on, determined to find Ravenswood, or what remained of it. Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, she saw the sign, "Welcome to Ravenswood." The sight sent a shiver through her. The sign was old, weathered by time and the elements, but it stood as a marker of something once tangible. She parked her car near the edge of the village and stepped out, the air cold and heavy. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint crunch of her boots on the cobblestones. The village square looked like a place frozen in time. Claire's eyes were drawn to the fountain in the center, its statue of a robed figure eerily lifelike. The dry basin seemed to whisper of untold stories, and the inscription at its base, "Ravenswood Endures," caught her attention. She snapped a few photos, her instincts taking over as she documented every detail. The cottages surrounding the square were dark, their windows like empty eyes staring back at her. She approached one of the houses, her flashlight casting long shadows across the stone walls. The door creaked open with little resistance. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. The table was still set for dinner, plates and cutlery covered in layers of grime. A chair lay overturned, as if someone had left in a hurry. But it was the feeling that unnerved her most, a sense of being watched, of something lingering just beyond her field of vision. "Hello?" Claire called out, her voice echoing unnaturally. She felt foolish, but the oppressive silence was unbearable. No answer came, but as she turned to leave, she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was a single word, carried on the air like a distant echo. "Leave." Claire froze. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she steadied herself. She had heard whispers before on old recordings, in the static of radios while investigating haunted sites. This was different. It felt alive, directed at her. Gathering her courage, she stepped back outside. The mist had thickened, swirling around her ankles like tendrils. The lampposts began to flicker, their glow faint and unnatural. She turned toward her car, but it was no longer visible through the fog. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone. No signal. Of course not. As she tried to orient herself, she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. A shadow darted between the cottages, too quick to be fully seen. Claire's breath hitched. She wasn't alone. "Thomas?" she called out, the absurdity of the question dawning on her as soon as she spoke it. She moved toward where she'd seen the shadow, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The square was empty again, the fountain standing silent and imposing. But the whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and indistinct. They swirled around her, rising to a cacophony that drowned out her own thoughts. And then they stopped. Standing at the edge of the square was a figure. It was barely more than a silhouette, but Claire could see it clearly through the mist. It was a man, tall and still. He raised a hand, as if beckoning her closer. Claire hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But something about the figure felt familiar, compelling. Against all logic, she stepped forward. "Thomas?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move, but as she drew closer, she realized something was terribly wrong. It wasn't Thomas. Claire stopped mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. The figure ahead of her didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, shrouded in mist, its features obscured but somehow wrong. Its stillness was unnerving, as though it were more statue than man. Yet there was a strange familiarity to its posture, its outline, that made her hesitate to turn and run. The whispers began again, faint at first, like a breeze passing through rustling leaves, but they grew louder, their tones overlapping, urgent and unintelligible. Claire gripped her flashlight tightly, her knuckles white, and took another cautious step forward. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you Thomas?" The figure tilted its head slightly, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill racing down her spine. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised its arm again, pointing toward one of the cottages. The motion was stiff, almost mechanical, like a puppet on strings. Claire's eyes followed the gesture. The cottage it pointed to was identical to the others. Weathered stone walls, a crooked roof, and dark windows that seemed to watch her. Yet something about it felt different, like the shadows around it were darker, thicker, more alive. She swallowed hard, her pulse pounding in her ears. The figure lowered its arm and stepped backward, fading into the mist without a sound. Within moments, it was gone, leaving Claire alone in the square. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to run back to her car and never look back. But the mist had swallowed the road, and some invisible force seemed to hold her here, compelling her toward the cottage. Taking a deep breath, she forced her feet to move. As she approached the door, she noticed the faint imprint of a hand on the wooden surface, as though someone had pressed their palm there recently. The air around the cottage felt colder, heavier, almost suffocating. She hesitated at the threshold, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the floor inside. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice trembling. "If anyone's here, I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just looking for answers." The silence that followed was oppressive. The air seemed to hum with unspoken tension, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Steeling herself, Claire stepped inside. The interior was much like the other house she had explored, dust-covered furniture, remnants of a life abandoned in haste. But this house felt different. The dust seemed disturbed, the air thicker. On the table lay a book, its leather cover cracked with age. The symbol of a raven encircled by thorny branches was embossed on the cover. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She remembered seeing that symbol before in her research about the area. It had been tied to local folklore about a village cursed by a broken pact with spirits. Her fingers hovered over the book, hesitant to touch it. But before she could decide, a low creak echoed through the room. She froze, her flashlight beam darting toward the source of the sound. One of the doors at the back of the house had opened, revealing a dark hallway. Her gut clenched, every nerve screaming for her to turn and leave. But curiosity, a dangerous, insistent force, kept her rooted to the spot. The whispers returned, louder now, more distinct. They seemed to be coming from the hallway, beckoning her forward. The voices overlapped, some angry, some mournful, others pleading. As she stepped closer to the hallway, the temperature dropped further, her breath now visible in the icy air. The hallway was narrow, the walls lined with faded photographs. Claire shone her flashlight on one, squinting to make out the details. It was a family portrait, parents with 2 children, all smiling, but their eyes were black, empty voids that stared directly at her. She jerked her flashlight away, her stomach twisting with nausea. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The hallway ended at a single door, slightly ajar, a dim light spilling from within. With trembling hands, Claire pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, barely furnished. In the center stood a wooden chair, and seated in it was a figure, motionless, slumped, and barely visible in the dim light. Her flashlight illuminated the face, and her breath hitched. It was Thomas. He looked pale, almost translucent, as though he were fading from existence. His eyes were half open, unfocused, staring blankly at the wall. His lips moved faintly, forming words she couldn't hear. She stepped closer, her voice a choked whisper. "Thomas, is that you?" His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment there was recognition. But then his face twisted in terror, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. His hand shot out, grabbing hers with a grip like ice. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the rising whispers. "It's too late. They won't let you leave." Before Claire could respond, the room went black and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Claire awoke on the cold, hard floor of the room, her head pounding and her limbs heavy. The darkness was absolute. The whispers now a low hum reverberating through the walls. She struggled to sit up, the icy grip of Thomas's hand still vivid in her memory. "Thomas?" she croaked, her voice hoarse. But there was no response. Her flashlight was gone, and the only light came from a faint, pulsating glow emanating from the doorway. She forced herself to her feet, each movement slow and labored, as though the air itself were pressing against her. The glow led her back into the hallway, where the photographs on the walls now seemed distorted. The smiling faces stared down at her with malevolence, their eyes following her every step. The whispers grew louder as she approached the front of the house, now coherent enough to form phrases. "The pact is broken. Another must remain. You cannot leave." Claire reached the doorway to the square and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The village had transformed. The mist was thicker, swirling like a living thing, and the lampposts now cast an unnatural blood-red light. Shadows darted between the cottages, humanoid forms that dissolved into smoke when she tried to focus on them. In the center of the square stood Thomas. His back was to her, his posture stiff and unnatural. The fountain behind him had begun to trickle with dark, viscous water, and the robed statue now seemed to watch her with hollow, judging eyes. "Thomas!" she called, stepping toward him. "What's happening? What is this place?" He didn't turn immediately. When he did, his face was different, paler, more angular, his eyes sunken and glowing faintly. He looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and something darker, something resigned. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "They won't let you go now, just like they wouldn't let me." Claire's chest tightened. "What are you talking about? Who won't let me go?" "The shadows," Thomas said, gesturing to the figures flitting between the buildings. "The ones bound to this place. Ravenswood isn't just cursed. It's a trap. The pact was supposed to keep the village and its people safe, but when it broke, the village became hungry." Claire shook her head, disbelief warring with terror. "What does that mean? Why did you stay?" Thomas took a step closer, his expression pained. "I didn't stay. I tried to leave, but the village claimed me. It needs someone to bind the shadows, to renew the pact. That's how it survives. It needed me. Until you came." Her stomach dropped. No, you're wrong. I'm not staying here. I'll find a way out." Thomas reached out, his icy fingers grazing her arm. "You can't leave, Claire. The village won't let you. Just unless." His words trailed off, but she understood the implication. Someone had to stay. Someone had to take the place of the bound soul to keep the shadows contained. The whispers grew louder as if they could sense her realization, urging her toward the inevitable. "No," she said, backing away. "I can't. I won't." Thomas's expression darkened, a faint glow in his eyes flickering. "Then it will take you by force. That's how it works." The shadows around them began to close in, their forms becoming more distinct. Claire could see their faces now, horrifying, twisted visages of people who had once been alive. Their mouths gaped open, emitting the terrible whispers that filled the air. Panic surged through her. She spun around, searching for an escape. Her car was still where she'd left it, barely visible through the mist. Without thinking, she bolted toward it, the shadows shrieking in protest as they gave chase. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the cobblestones slick and uneven. She stumbled but caught herself, the car growing closer with each step. She fumbled for the door handle, throwing herself inside and slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life, and for a moment hope flared in her chest. But as she tried to drive, the same invisible force that had trapped Thomas's car held hers in place. The shadows surrounded the vehicle, their forms pressing against the windows. The whispers turned to screams, an overwhelming cacophony that made her ears ring. In her desperation, Claire grabbed her camera, which lay on the passenger seat. She snapped a photo of the square, hoping to capture proof of what she'd seen. The flash lit up the darkness, and for a brief moment, the shadows recoiled. It was enough. She jammed the gearshift into reverse, slamming the accelerator. The car lurched backward, thus breaking free of the invisible grip. The shadows screamed in rage as the mist began to thin. Claire didn't stop, didn't look back, her only focus on escaping Ravenswood. When the village sign finally appeared in her rearview mirror, the whispers ceased. The air grew lighter and the road smoothed beneath her tires. She drove until the first hints of dawn broke the horizon, not stopping until she reached a gas station miles away. There, she finally dared to look at the photo on her camera. The square was empty. No shadows, no Thomas, no fountain. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the robed statue. Its head was turned, looking directly at the camera.